Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Petra Cicoric and I'm the conference chair. I'm delighted to welcome you all today to the opening of Atlantic Forum's Autumn Conference that is centered around the topic of NATO and discontinuities, rethinking security. Arguably today's world is as unpredictable as it has ever been, despite the fact that it is led and dominated by patterns that we recognize as strategic trends. The aftermath of COVID-19 has shed light on just how unpredictable this current security environment can be. However, even before the pandemic, the international community already recognized that threats can come from both state and non-state actors. They can come dressed as terrorist attacks, cyber attacks, natural disasters, biohazards, dual-use technology, implementations of martial laws. These and many others are challenging our adaptation and response. The international security environment has metamorphosed into a grey area where the borders between war and peace are continuously blurred, and the fog of war is getting thicker. In this complex, as we said, asymmetric and multi-layered security environment, our trend lines are susceptible to strategic shocks and surprises that can alter their direction, slow them down, speed them up, or stop them entirely. As antagonists are using unconventional tactics and strategies in order to enhance their possibilities of victory and project power. Some of these threats and events are faceless. They do not pose any conceptual antagonists. Some are lurking in the shadows, while some are so well camouflaged that we might struggle to notice them in the plain sight. These events are known as discontinuities, and in this conference we will delve deeper into them in order to further discussion on the topic and to engage the audience's and speakers' imagination. In 2017, Rand Corporation described discontinuities, or so-called black swans, as developments that were deemed impossible and thus never considered. However, they proved consequential enough to change history, making a trend suddenly jump or disappear. According to their research, over the coming 25 years, disruptions and discontinuities in the international systems might be brought on by accelerating technologies, societal and economic dislocations, environmental stresses, or electoral unrest. Moreover, these discontinuities are likely to coexist and commingle in unexpected ways. Therefore, the researchers have urged and stressed the importance for policymakers to spend more time anticipating possible changes in the world, since certain continuities, such as climate change or technological advancement, can become a discontinuity if those developments reach a disruption threshold. This very fluid and relatively new landscape of threats requires us to explore and understand realms of security and defense that we might have not thought of as possible or even probable, in order to attempt to predict the so-called unpredictable. However, we should first understand the underlying security trends, and only then will we be able to think of possible strategic shocks and surprises and ascertain how we can prevent them or at least minimize their impact. In order to do so, we must step back, take a holistic approach to the future security environment, and empowering NATO's adaptability and readiness in order to continue to successfully guarantee the political freedom and military security to NATO members. After all, we are only as strong as our weakest link. Approaching the future with a critical mindset helps us prepare and anticipate a changing world. And only through this critical mindset will we be able to minimize our adversaries' gains, establish a sustainable and long-term military and political strategy, build a comprehensive resilience that will encompass not just our infrastructure, but our legal, societal, and cognitive domain as well. Wilhelm Stephenson once said that we are always presented with two kinds of problems: the imaginary and the real. And indeed, his remark was made in regards to the Arctic. However, With this conference, we argue that of the two, the imaginary seems to be the most real in every theatre of fiction. In order to discover why, I would like to kindly invite you to join us in our panel discussions, where by delving into the unknown and hypothetical, we aim to provide a fresh and innovative perspectives and out-of-the-box approaches to potential new changes and challenges in both modern and future warfare, so that we can broaden our horizons and bolster our resilience. Therefore, the Atlantic Forum will, with this conference, investigate the history of discontinuities, the importance of what-if mentality, all to answer the question on how we can better prepare for them and improve our resilience in both traditional domains, the newly established ones, and in hybrid settings. On the second day of the conference, you will hear Chair of the NATO Military Committee, Admiral Bauer's keynote address, prior to delving into the future of law and war, long-term geostrategy in space, cybersecurity and the threat of non-state actors and EDTs, and how to detect and deter hybrid warfare. On the third day of the conference, we will be joined by Assistant Secretary General for Disruptive and Emerging Technologies, David Van Wiel, after which we will have a chance to hear about the impact of discontinuities in climate change and political institutions. During the panel discussions and assessments with high-level subject matter experts from a variety of organizations, we will be providing an in-depth analysis into challenges that discontinuities can pose, all while referring to NATO's 7 baseline requirements that are encompassing continuity of government and critical government services, energy supplies, ability to deal effectively with uncontrolled movement of people, food and water resources, ability to deal with mass casualties, telecommunication networks, and transportation systems. Before handing the floor over to our first keynote speaker, Brigadier General Didier Polomé, Assistant Chief of Staff Strategic Planners and Policy and Defense Planning at NATO ACT, I would like to take a moment on behalf of Atlantic Forum and the conference team to thank all of our wonderful speakers for accepting our invitations and for their contribution to these topics over the next 3 days. Without them, this event would not be possible. We are proud that our speakers are truly representing the transatlantic community and that we as an Atlantic Forum take great pride in fostering an all-generation approach to these very timely and interesting topics, with all panels including young professionals. Moreover, we would like to thank the NATO for supporting this event. Lastly, I would like to thank my brilliant team, Julia, Solange, Amber, Marie, Willem and Callan, for putting together this thought-provoking program, and to the wonderful Atlantic Forum team, John, Igor, Elena and Marie, for supporting us on this journey. Lastly, we would like to thank all of you, our wonderful viewers, for joining us on this 3-day journey into the unknown. As you're watching this, you have a unique opportunity to engage with the speakers throughout the conference by posing your questions in a YouTube livestream, during Slido polls, and patrons also have the exclusive access to the Zoom room for networking between the panels. In conclusion, we live in a very challenging world and in a very challenging time, and there is always a need to adapt. Despite the complexity and uncertainty of contemporary world, NATO is the strongest and most enduring military alliance, since we are continuously adapting and evolving alongside of our challenges. We are indeed stronger together, but the only constant is change. The sheer importance to imagine the unimaginable and expect the unexpected is a true testament of the alliance's strength and unity. The advantage we have as an alliance is the community of values that brings our people together to achieve our common goals. We hope that through this conference you will learn something new, and that it will light a spark that will shine through all your future endeavours. And now, let us start by welcoming our first keynote speaker. It is my great pleasure to welcome Brigadier General Didier Polomé, Assistant Chief of Staff Strategic Plans and Policy and Defence Planning, NATO ACT, to the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone, and greetings from Supreme Allied Command Transformation in Norfolk, Virginia, NATO's home in North America. I am honored and excited to open the Atlantic Forum Autumn Conference. The theme you aim to unpack in the next 2 days, NATO and Discontinuities, how we should rethink security, is exactly what we in ACT do for a living. In 2014, the security environment in and around Europe changed fundamentally, and we have seen an increasingly toxic mix of protectionism in economics, isolationism in the foreign affairs, and xenophobia in politics. Not favorable for a multilateral organization like NATO. COVID added a new layer of distress, suffering, societal and economic disruptions. The environment became less stable and predictable and remains continuously challenged. The boundaries between peace and conflict, political and military, strategic and tactical, kinetic and non-kinetic, are increasingly blurring and complicating the alliance's ability to respond in a timely and cohesive manner. Our adversaries and challengers are using every opportunity and every tool available to exploit our vulnerabilities, weaken our cohesion, and disrupt our nations and the alliance from within. NATO has to cope with state and non-state actors that fundamentally oppose, seek to alter, or even destroy the rules-based international order and the system of values that NATO was established to protect. In doing so, potential strategic competitors deploy increasingly sophisticated strategies, often through coordinated political, military, economic, and information efforts. They are attempting to push us down the path that suits their ambitions and their preferred methods of competition and conflict. This creates the most dangerous and destabilizing risks, ones that emanate from the interplay between external threats and internal weaknesses. If successful, these activities could fragment the alliance center of gravity. The essential elements of credible alliance deterrence and defense posture are cohesion and demonstrable political will, robust and recognizable military capability, and clear and convincing strategic communication and deterrent messaging. These remain the pillars of our strength. Unfortunately, in the last few years, some significant disagreements among allies have been made public, further complicating NATO's ability to reach consensus on appropriate actions. For 30 to act together as one at the speed of relevance requires a shared understanding of today's threats and those of the future, a shared vision of action, and a shared weight of burdens. Since 2018, allies have embarked on the path to redefine this shared vision. In 2018, the NATO military authorities agreed a NATO military strategy, the first such document since 1968. Stemming from it, in 2019, allies agreed to develop two key concepts. The first, deterrence and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area, deals with threats of today. The second, the NATO warfighting capstone concept, prepares NATO to deal with the threats and challenges of tomorrow. In 2021, allies also accepted the Secretary General's vision of NATO 2030, and in 2022, we will build on all these documents and replace the 2010 strategic concept with the new one, uniting allies around a new vision of the world for decades to come. Let me now turn to what we at ACT believe are some answers to the questions you will be elaborating on and discussing over the next 2 days. In a NATO warfighting capstone concept, we provided an aspirational and functional design for the development of NATO's military instrument of power over the next 20 years. In it, unsurprisingly, we share the view that the security environment NATO faces is fluid, boundless, and complex. The more one looks to the future, the more uncertain it becomes. But in ACT, we promote an anticipatory and proactive approach. We believe that the military instrument of power, alongside other instruments of power, has to persistently and simultaneously shape the strategic environment, contest our adversaries, and if comes to it, effectively fight. By shaping, I mean using our instruments of power to build advantage. It is incumbent on the alliance to positively and proactively shape the security environment to its own design and strength, its ideas, its values, partnerships, and integrated military structure. So instead of continuously adjusting and trying to catch up to match our competitors, we should shape the future environment to suit our strengths. This can be done in many ways. For example, by fielding game-changing capabilities, or changing how we operate in the virtual space, or by engaging a broad network of partners. By contesting, I mean denying others the ability to gain advantage so that we can uphold our own objectives, such as operating freely in any domain or contesting area. This would require sometimes different long-term capabilities, sometimes a stronger political stance, and sometimes a radical change in NATO's posture. But the key is in our ability to quickly identify changes in the environment and launch agile, tailored, and comprehensive responses. These will contest and deny our adversaries and challenges, to our freedom of action. But if all else fails, we need to be ready to fight and win, no matter the adversary, no matter the weapons, no matter the resources required. We need to fight coherently in all domains. Success demands that all NATO's instruments of power work cohesively and seamless together to achieve alliance goals and objectives. As I mentioned at the beginning, looking 20 years ahead and predicting what the world will look like and how to be ready for it is a difficult task. However, we are starting to understand the nature of this long game much better. The NATO 2030 reflections process and the NATO warfighting capstone concept 20-year horizon attest to this. At ACT, we have taken an approach that is informed by the current threat picture, but looks beyond it as we guide development of our forces. We now have to think and plan long-term after decades of discretionary operations and dealing with the crisis of the day. Our warfighting capstone concept is adversary-centric but proactively driven by NATO's own requirements for success. In the future, we need to be able to outthink our adversary by anticipating threats and understanding the strategic environment, out-excel them by striving towards excellence through integrity, people, and culture, outfight them by operating decisively within and across domains, outpace them by recognizing risk, seizing opportunities, deciding and acting faster than any potential adversary. We have to outpartner them as well by building interoperability and fostering mutual supportive relationships and partnerships. And finally, outlast them by enduring as long as it takes through competition and any conflict situation. We are also broadening our thinking and ability to act in this multi-domain, multi-regional, and multi-instrumental context. We know that we need to deliver actions across land, sea, air, space, and cyber domain to create effects in the physical, virtual, and cognitive dimensions. In doing this, new technologies give us so many opportunities but also numerous risks. Emergent and disruptive technologies, EDTs, are also beginning to turn speculative fictions into reality. Quantum sensing could make oceans transparent. High-end decryption capabilities could make secure communication as open as the front page of a newspaper. Losing control of satellites and the electromagnetic spectrum could degrade alliance capabilities. And lethal autonomous weapon systems are likely to challenge long-standing ethical and legal norms. These developments are becoming increasingly feasible operational realities of warfare and must be considered as we shape the future NATO strategy. So returning to the theme of this conference, what about discontinuities? What I have described so far is our direction of travel to address an increasingly challenging, complex, and uncertain security environment where we face persistent, boundless, and simultaneous threats. But what about strategic shocks or black swan events? Events that could potentially upend our current calculus and disrupt planners' and decision-makers' views of the future. How do we prepare for and manage such potentially high-impact events, especially if their likelihood seems very low and resources are, as ever, constrained? The ongoing pandemic is perhaps a glimpse into this world. Entire organizations are dedicated to strategic foresight and examining current trends. Indeed, ACT has invested heavily in this space. But NATO also needs tools to help determine how these trends might be disrupted and what alternative futures might mean for Allied political cohesion and military planning. We are just starting this journey, and so this conference is incredibly timely given this challenging and multifaceted topic. I would like to leave you with a quote by our Supreme Allied Commander Transformation, General Philippe Lavigne. We face an uncertain future, but we face it together. Let's be bold enough to embrace innovation, smart enough to grow our agility, and open enough to learn from allied industries. We can win together as a team. I'm excited about that shared future. I wish you the best for your conference and good luck.
Apologies. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the first panel of the Atlantic Forum's Autumn Conference. I am Willem the Tulip Troost, and I will be your moderator. We encourage you to participate throughout the panel. In the YouTube description, you can find a link to slido.com, where you can participate in polls and submit your questions to our speakers. You can also scan this QR code that will be appearing next to me shortly on your phone to access a mobile version. Please submit questions throughout the panel, as I will weave them in throughout the next hour. To start off, I would encourage you all to fill out the series of questions that should be live on Slido right now. These are intended to give us a baseline of your knowledge at the start of the conference, and while I will touch on the results later this panel, we will rerun the poll on Sunday to see how far your understanding has progressed. So, over the next hour, our panelists will explore the term and theme of discontinuities, which forms the basis of the conference. To better understand what we mean by discontinuities, let us be transported to a bird's eye view of 20th century America. As we look across the century, we can discern certain trends. For instance, significant improvements in human welfare in the form of life expectancy, which rockets from under 50 in men in 1910 to over 75 by the turn of the century. Similarly, we need not look further than the growth of cities and urbanization, as well as the similarly rapid population explosion, to see significant trend lines that stretch across the century. These, though, are fundamentally unsurprising trends, even if they occurred at an accelerated pace. In the literature, these events are known as white swans, or continuities. However, it is equally evident that there are developments over the century that cause trend lines to jump. These are our black swans, our discontinuities. Events deemed impossible and once not even considered, yet eventually proven consequential enough to change history. Let us take, for example, the development of nuclear weapons. In 1900, the capability was barely imaginable, yet by the last quarter of the century, the destruction of the entire world in global thermonuclear war was a definite possibility. Or let us take the internet, which has quite rapidly transformed the way we communicate and share information. I cannot imagine living without the World Wide Web, but the first website was only published in 1991. But these discontinuities do not need to be some new technological change. They can be social, such as birth control pill, or others. Think for a moment of the events of the last few years. Have we not all just experienced a discontinuity rear its head? To further explore discontinuities, and indeed the importance of asking what if, I would like to introduce the two esteemed panelists who will be sharing their knowledge and expertise with us over the next hour. Captain Alan M. Siegrist, United States Navy, and Alexandra Martin, Policy Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. So, Captain Alan Siegrist was a native of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, who graduated in the Leadership, Education, and Development program at the United States Naval Academy, receiving a master's degree in leadership and serving 2 years as a leadership, ethics, and law instructor, as well as serving as surface warfare congressional liaison. He is currently serving in a joint position with the Strategic Alternatives Branch at NATO Allied Command Transportation in Norfolk, Virginia. Alexandra, or Alex Martin, is at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. She has a master's in conflict management and economics from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where she concentrated in conflict negotiations and post-conflict reconstruction. Following her master's, she was a policy consultant for the German Marshall Fund of the United States in Washington, D.C., where she provided expert advice on topics such as transatlantic relations, security policy, Russia and the West, and the geopolitical implications of conflicts in Eastern Europe. She then worked at GlobSec, where she is still an associate fellow, becoming head of the Brussels office in January 2020, where she established the organization's first abroad office. As of March 2021, she is now back with the German Marshall Fund of the United States as Rethink CEE Policy Fellow, and of course, now a full-time mother. My congratulations to you, Alex. Before I open the floor up to opening remarks from our speakers, I would like to remind everyone to take part in this panel by following the Slido link in the description to submit questions to our panelists. I also want to stress that the panelists reserve the right to refuse any question. With that, let us begin with introductory remarks from our panelists, starting with Captain Alan Segrist.
Can you guys hear me? Somebody just said I was muted. Okay, fantastic. More simply, every day we live in the world of what ifs. So it's a fun job. It really is. It's a hard job. I've never done anything like this before, but I love it. Every day we use our brains quite a bit. Let me throw a quote at you. Nassim Nicholas Taleb, author of Black Swan. He says the future will be increasingly less predictable, while both human nature and social science seem to conspire to hide the idea from us. If you haven't read that book, it's a great book. I definitely recommend it. Ties in absolutely well with what we're talking about today. In the Salt Branch, we don't try to forecast the future. Anytime you try to predict the future, it's dangerous, because as soon as you get it wrong, everybody stops listening to you. You lose your audience. So definitely dangerous to try to predict the future. But we recognize that in organizations, no matter if it's NATO or your national militaries or even corporations, as planners, action officers, strategic thinkers, and even leaders, we can get caught up on the day-to-day grind, producing products, getting your due outs done. And I think this craziness occurs at the expense of critical what-if thinking. I think it gets in the way. Further, those organizations that do have branches that focus on the future, some call them strategic foresight, there's many names for those kind of branches, are usually focused on trends and trying to figure out the most likely future so that they can guide the organization in the right direction, if you will. And they focus on what will happen in what I've heard it called the extended present, or maybe the familiar future, as opposed to the unthought future, which Sweeney and Sardar talked about in their paper from 2015. This last one, the unthought future, that's where Salt Branch operates. We spend our time thinking about the plausible, the possible, and even the preposterous. More simply, what could happen, what might happen, or what most think as just ridiculous or approaching the impossible. Why do we do that? Because we think that if history is any indication, shocks and surprises will continue indefinitely. We try to figure out try to think through what the next 9/11 would be, or the next pandemic, or the fall of Kabul. What kind of events like that are looming in our future? We've been tasked to think disruptively, to challenge conventional thinking through analysis of continuities, shocks, strategic surprises, really in order to foster strategic innovation, preparation, and just resiliency. Dr. Andy Hines, in his book, Thinking About the Future, says that organizations should explore new ideas that cause discomfort. They should seek out ideas that make the organization feel uneasy. And while that's not always a comfortable place to be in an organization, to make leaders uneasy or uncomfortable, it's absolutely necessary and imperative. And that's what we're trying to do here in our little SALT branch. Someone said predicting the future is dangerous, and therefore we shouldn't do it. And I counter that not thinking about the future, not thinking about the what ifs, it's even more dangerous, as history has proven. So thanks again, happy to be here, and looking forward to the discussion today.
Okay, I all good. I'm really glad to be back with the Atlantic Forum. Hello to everyone in the community. I'm a very proud patron of the Atlantic Forum, and I'm also very glad to slowly get back in the professional life, as Will mentioned. So I'm Alex Martin. I'm currently work as a Rethinking fellow with GMF, focusing actually on the influence of China in Eastern Europe, and an associate fellow with GlobSec. Let me just kickstart some of the ideas that I put together to start the conversation. And I do want to start with the definition of resilience according to OECD. And that's the capacity to absorb and recover from shocks and efficiently adapt to an extraordinary context without major disruption. So I think that that's where the starting point is. And while before we were looking at countries and institutions, I think that the conversation now focuses on everyone, from the individual to the society, to countries and the institutions, and the relationships between them. And I think that that's a very important start of the conversation about resilience. Secondly, as Alan also said, it's not possible to prevent every single possible shock. And I think that would be actually crazy and ridiculous. First, because we have finite and scarce resources. Secondly, because we don't know what we don't know. And thirdly, because many scenarios which are improbable or ridiculous could take a lot of resources from actually preparing for that adaptation, not necessarily being ready for a future that might come, that we want to come or we are familiar with, but actually to be able to react regardless of what comes our way. And I think that the role of foresight, especially from the think tank community perspective, the alternative futures and the scenario planning is very important, and not just on the military side of the story, but also on the civilian side. And I'm going to touch upon this a bit later. So these are the instruments, in my view, that help identify emerging crises and over the horizon, but they're also helping us to try to find some blind spots and prepare for the unexpected. So a few things on when it comes to the resilience from my previous experience, or building also on my deployment in post-conflict and civil military cooperation job that I had. I think that we need to have a full spectrum resilience approach. And when I'm looking at the full spectrum, I'm comparing it to a multi-domain integration from the military perspective, or a full military spectrum, because shocks are rarely, if ever, affecting just one segment of a country or of an institution or the population. It impacts to various degrees and to various level of magnitude, both civilian infrastructure, which is critical for military readiness, force deployment, and so on and so forth. So we'd have to look at resilience from the individual to society to country, institutions, so on and so forth. I think that the NATO 7 baseline requirements and the indicators for the allied nations is agreed also now in Brussels in June. It's a great move forward when it comes to guiding the allies into the right direction. I think what will be very important will be the implementation side. And I know there are indicators. I am not working for NATO, so I don't know exactly how the reporting works. But I think that will be a very important part of the job. And why is that? It's because it is very difficult to monitor and evaluate the level of resilience ex ante in the end. So how do you make sure that you are resilient enough for, I don't know, a climate crisis related? You don't know until after in the aftermath. So how do we make sure that we have the level of readiness required? I do want to touch upon a few major future trends that maybe we can discuss any further, and I would be very interested to hear how NATO ACT thinks about it. And I think that geopolitical competition and the great power conflicts, something to look forward, non-state actors with tremendous capabilities, a bit at private sector, but also paramilitary groups, so on and so forth. I think that we should look at the cyberspace operations intensified, and also I would also tag in the outer space, climate change and emerging disruptive technologies as accelerators, demographics and migration, arms control architecture, and the terra nullius approach, so the nobody's land and who's gonna grab it. And maybe I want to add in also the new economic models and trade, and rare minerals, for example, will be one of the very big point of contention between the West and, for example, China when it comes to renewables, batteries, chips, and so on. And let me finish my 5 minutes, which I think are a bit longer, with 3 ideas for NATO moving forward beyond the current efforts, which are to be applauded, but also I think no longer enough given how quickly and at the pace that we are currently running. So the first idea or the first recommendation is to define what's critical, because if everything is critical, nothing is critical. And that's actually a debate that we had also with think tanks and private sector. What is actually, where do we see the critical areas, and how do we work to ensure that those are protected? We need to have within this a vulnerability map across the alliance, match against the types of possible shocks and levels of magnitude. At the end, the alliance is as strong as its weakest ally or member. Maybe create a tracker with indicators for seeing evolution in terms of resilience efforts and coordination, and maybe encouraging regional groupings in developing resilience efforts together, in going beyond the burden sharing policy, but more into a responsibility sharing approach. Secondly, I think that we need a better link between resilience efforts, the baseline requirements, and the emerging disruptive technologies, and the 18 that are part of the innovation board. And I think that many future shocks will be less kinetic, so EDT will help not just with foresight and prevention, but also with deterrence and response. And I'm looking at hypersonic missiles, quantum computing, and AI, just a few of the technologies that will make it or break it, both for the West, but also for our adversaries and competitors. And lastly, one of the areas that is very dear to my heart, I think, is the strengthening of the civil-military cooperation dimension. Resilience efforts done just by not work and will not work in a vacuum. That will ensure better cooperation in terms of crisis. It will lead to a minimal dysfunctioning of the institutions in times of crisis, and decision making will still happen, will be in place, but we'll also have checks and balances. And with that, I'm getting ready to you, Will, hearing also the conversation and look forward to hearing also the questions from the audience.
Thank you both for those. Thank you both. Brilliant introductory remarks. Brilliant.
Something that Alex picked up on, something that Al picked up on, something that Al mentioned, and something that Al mentioned, and something that Al mentioned. So concept of resilience. This comes up a lot when we're discussing discontinuities. This comes up in our day-to-day life. In our day-to-day life, what do we want in our day-to-day life? Do we want to be resilient? And as you said, what do we want to be resilient? One thing that both sides of the Atlantic being quite affected by a lack of both sides of the Atlantic being quite affected by a lack of our global supply chains. Our global supply chains. Just in time. How can we ensure that supply chains for both civilian and military, for both civilian and military operations to keep going, continue to keep going, take so long to come back online, take so little shock, come back online. This is especially important. This is especially as we do not know, as may not be a pandemic, may not be a pandemic, may not be a pandemic, it might be cyber warfare, it might be cyber. How can the civilian baseline of the military world build up into effect no matter come into effect no matter the discontinuity?
Is that to Alan, to me? I'm happy to pick up. Is that to Alan, to me? Is that to Alan first? I'm happy to pick up first. And all your eggs in one basket. All your eggs in one basket. All your eggs in one basket. Here, pandemic also showed us what this means. When pandemic also showed us what pandemic also showed us what this means. When supply chains are dependent on sources, dependent on sources, severely affected because of severely affected because severely affected because all the logistics, I think that diversification, partners when it comes to trade. I do not believe partners when it comes to trade. I do not when it comes to trade. I do not open trade. I do not think that reshoring trade or open trade. Reshoring, some reshoring. We need diversification. Some reshoring. Some reshoring. We need diversification. See which are the two. We need to which are the two. Which are where exactly should come back home. Should come back between Brussels. Where exactly? Because it will still happen between Brussels and Bucharest. Same still happen, and maybe it will last. Have the same type of impact. Maybe it will last shorter. But we need to have the diversification, both in terms of we need to have the diversification, but also in terms of geographication. Location, but also in terms of transportation, of logistics and infrastructure, in terms of logistics and infrastructure. So that would be my 2 cents on it.
Hard to follow you, Alex. Hard to follow. I am not hard to follow you, Alex. I am not. But I would say, first of all, the beauty of having, I would say, alliances that have redundancies built in. So redundancies, sure they have redundancies. Those redundancies, sure those redundancies for areas such as supply chain. And I would like to absolutely compare. And we have like and I would like to plan. And we have ahead of time. That we have. I would say ahead of time. At least from my perspective, at least from my perspective, on a daily basis, we need to dive into issues, not just what are the effects of that problem, and looking deeper into how is this really going to affect NATO? Is it just affecting the food and logistics, supplies to the troops, or are there other kind of unthought of impacts? And I think it's a great topic, and I would love to do some deep dive and think some more about it. But I think, again, redundancies are important, and that leads to resilience. So we have to figure out what those things that we have that we absolutely need, and we need to make sure we're talking about how to build the redundancies and how to prevent the surprises and the shocks.
That's brilliant. Thank you both. Now, coming back to what you said about having to build those resiliencies and redundancies, and sort of those resiliencies and redundancies, and sort of abstracting to another level. How can organizations such as NATO build resilience, as you said, build redundancies, as you said, when they do not know what form discontinuity is going to take? How can you decide what it is and in what form it needs to be protected?
Thanks, Will. That's an easy question. That's an easy question. I will tell you that here at ACT, we're thinking pretty hard about resilience. We actually have a line of delivery within our NATO warfighting capstone concept, which is the NATO North Star warfighting development document that we developed here over the past few years. And we're working really hard at thinking through how to become a more resilient organization. I would say it's tough because when you have 30 nations and other partners and you're trying to be resilient, it makes it challenging when you have that large of an organization. So we're doing a lot of hard work within ACT to think about layered resilience and what that means, and how to become more resilient. The other piece of that is and I'm kind of proud of this because it's what my branch does, is we need to dig deep and really put our creative minds to use and do some critical thinking about what are those things that are really going to bite us? And that's why, every day we're brainstorming and trying to come up with what are those discontinuities that we absolutely do not expect. For example, we wrote a food for thought paper here and regarding an asteroid strike. I mean, who would ever think that an asteroid strike would happen here on Earth? But there are organizations out there. In fact, we just saw something regarding NASA is going to, launch and do some work on figuring out how to take out an asteroid if it does actually threaten Earth. So it's things like that. It's topics like that we're going to continue to think through and really just get the conversation started and generate the discussion, which I think grows resiliency for the organization. Hope that answered your question.
Well, if I can jump because I've been close to NATO during the Agenda 2030
I've been close
reflection
to NATO during the
Agenda 2030
reflection,
sector,
and really
the dialogues with
strike
private sector, and
by
really
the amount of efforts
in that regard.
But I think
by
that
the amount of efforts
we should also
in that
zoom
regard.
a bit in,
But I
and
think that
see at the end of the day
we should
who
also
is,
zoom a bit in and see
the
at the
main
end of the day
responsible
who
for
is
strengthening resilience. And I think that
the
we need
main
to go back at
responsible
the state
for
level and strengthening resilience.
without,
and I think that we need to go back at the
yes,
state
there
level.
is a role for
and,
NATO, there is a role
without
for the European Union, and I
yes,
think
there is a role for NATO, there is a role for the
European
Union,
Union,
and
portfolio
I
of
think
things
that Vice President Shevchevich
shows.
but I think that
the
portfolio
of the day,
Vice President
Shevchevich
shows will.
But I think that
and
at
also
the
the
end of
priorities
the day,
from the capital will,
because
and also the
NATO
priorities
can focus, for
from the
example,
capital
on
because
scenario planning
NATO
on
can
papers and
focus, for
analytical
example, on
pieces,
scenario planning on papers
that go out of the realm of maybe
possible and plausible.
that go out of
I don't think
the
that's the
realm of
case
maybe
in the
possible
capitals
and
of the Allied
plausible.
Nations. I mean,
I
there
don't
are
think
so
that's
many
the case
priorities at home
in the capitals of the Allied
and
Nations.
that's
I mean,
one of
there are so many priorities
big,
at home.
Question mark when it comes to how resilient various allies
question mark when it
become
comes
and
to
what's the
how
timeline,
resilient various
because
allies
their domestic
become
priorities
and what's the timeline
because
are
their
more
domestic priorities
are more salient, let's put it that way, in certain countries. I don't know, looking now at the gas and energy prices, to the pandemic, to the overwhelmed health infrastructure during COVID-19 last year. So I think it's very, very difficult to strike the right balance between responding to the current, even past needs that are still having spillover and having the approach of, okay, let's think of the unthinkable, and let's try to be prepared for that moving forward. So to me, it goes down to actually the political will and the political capital in making foresight and thinking of the future a priority nationwide.
Brilliant. Thank you, Al. Thank you, Alex.
Picking up
now,
something you
mentioned in your being very down to the local level and the individuals. To what extent is resilience something that is applied top down or built bottom up?
I think it's multidimensional. It's from every side. It's horizontal. It's from every side. It's horizontal. I don't think. Again, I don't think. You build resilience. You build resilience
and training. It's not happening overnight. It's also a long-term process.
It's also a long-term
I'm talking
process.
also as an Eastern European
generation.
Eastern European
Generation
after the revolution.
So I
the
kind of
Romanian state,
all the
and the
changes
Romanian
of
society,
the Romanian state,
and everything
and
else,
the Romanian
and you
society,
realize that even
and
30
everything
plus
else,
years,
and you realize that even
after
30 plus
the
years,
fall of communism,
after the fall of communism, we still have reminiscent issues that are just continue to be, even if we build resilience towards, I don't know, the disinformation, for example, which is very much present in Eastern Europe and so on and so forth. So I don't think that we should look either or. We should use every possible mean and capacity to build individual, societal. But again, I think that we need to have, building on that, resilience, in my view, also needs to be linked to the national context or even the local context of what makes people, societies, institutions, administration, what makes them tick when it comes to think about the future. Because if in Romania you would do an exercise, a scenario building, and you would have, I don't know, 20 years ago about the possible invasion of an eastern neighbor in the Black Sea, that would be something that people for sure will react and will be very ready to build the resilience. If you're looking at something, I don't know, coming from Sahel region, which one is one of the areas of the greatest demographic changes and the climate impact, I don't think that if you look at Romania per se, you will necessarily have the same level of response and openness to think about those kind of futures. So I think that that's also very important. Even if we have a 30 allies and a transatlantic umbrella, I think that it's very important also to zoom in and see the context, either regional or a state level.
And I think that comes on to a point which I'd like to bring up now, because as you said, they have certain political priorities, and there's certain things that are certain events and discontinuities that people can perceive as possibilities. I mean, climate change is one 20 years ago that people were on the edge of and is now a real and present day, this is a discontinuity. But if discontinuities are in part defined by our inability to conceive of them, and when you come down to a local, state, and regional level, you have political will and different understandings, how can individuals and groups and institutions attempt to predict the unpredictable?
Is it a question for me? Yeah, no, a question for me. Difficult at all. Not difficult at all. Not difficult at all. Predict the unpredictable. I will go back to the definition of resilience. I will go back closer to the definition of resilience. You cannot, to my view, and there are the white swans, but there are also the gray swans, and there are the white swans, and black swans, color we will attribute to the swans, and God knows what other color we will attribute to the swans. Moving forward, is I think what we need to adopt to adapt to absorb shocks without regardless, absorb shocks without major disruption, regardless where that shock comes from to climate change a part of the earth, even in Europe, which climate is less likely for drought, even in Europe, which is less likely for the time being, to other possible scenarios that we can think of. I don't think that we need to predict the future. That the foresight or thinking of futures is not about predicting the future. It's actually getting ready to respond to shocks and absorb them without major disruptions to our citizens and to our people. Correct me if I'm wrong, Alan. I don't know how you guys look at it, but I think that you're doing the same thing. There are certain scenarios that you can possibly prepare and be ready for, but the rest is
I couldn't agree more, Alex. I couldn't agree more. Try to predict the future at all because we don't try. You said it perfectly because you just can't. But again, it's about perfectly. But thinking through, again, it's about the possibilities. Thinking and by doing that, the possibilities, and by doing that, you learn, and then you prepare from that learning, and that's what it's all about. So. History has shown that we haven't been able to predict the future. There have been many discontinuities, many black swans that have happened. So, and some would say that we kind of expected some of those black swans, which I guess would be more gray rhinos or whatever animal you want to use. But, you have to think through it and you have to build the resiliency. And I agree with you that has to happen from the top down and the bottom up, right? The national and local level is so very important. We can only do so much as an alliance, and trying to talk as an alliance with the nations to say, here's what maybe you should focus on as far as resiliency, but unless they have the will and want to invest in those areas, it's got to come from that lowest level.
Now, one that I'll put to both of you, but Al, you first is I think. But Al, you first is we talk about the and of course asking what not necessarily and of course that future, but again attempting to understand, but again attempting to understand the vulnerabilities of your organization, of your structures, of your organization, of your structures. In your opinion, in what way and what challenges do leaders face in building this culture into an organization, the culture of questioning the possibilities? Because in yourself as an organization, you are an arm of NATO. How can you help encourage NATO to think more broadly in its everyday and have every person at every level consider?
Let's see. I think the first start is, developing a branch like mine to get the right, we have some really smart people that think hard about, these things that could potentially happen but have never happened before. So that's the first step, is that you have to recognize that it's worth the time to think about these discontinuities. First thing. The other thing is, I think, as an organization, it's really hard, especially in a bureaucracy, right? Whether it's a military or a large organization like NATO, it's very easy for the leaders to put out, hey, these are the 10 things we're focused on. And in many cases, it's not thinking about discontinuities, right? It's how do we use our resources properly? How do we get more people into the organization? How do we recruit? How, there's many different high level objectives and focus areas. I think, leaders absolutely have to push these discontinuities and thinking about the future down to the lowest levels, right? To the people who are, we would say on a ship, on the deck plates every day, doing the jobs, doing the tasks, so that they can say, this is something that would affect my daily effort, right? You might not be able to see that at the high leadership level, but you've got to push it down to the, to all the people in the organization to recognize, hey, this might really hurt us if this happened.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And
thank you very much. And
do you think that there's a way that, do you think that there's a way that, do you think that there's a way that societies can build that within themselves?
I think that there is a need for international organization, academia, to actually work together towards building or strengthening resilience at all levels. I don't think that there is one single organism or part of this equation responsible for, and I don't think that this is a lone warrior effort. It needs to come from multiple ways, because what the military sees is not necessarily covering what the civilians might see. It's not necessarily what the academia thinks of. So just by having everyone part of the conversation, that's possible. And to add on what Alan said, I think it's important for the leaders to push down and to have ownership of the process, or co-ownership of the process. But I think that from the political or policy point of view, what makes people listen is the costs of not thinking about it. So what costs from economic to human losses to everything will a country or a region or an alliance endure if they're not prepared for disruptive futures? And I think that's where the conversation starts to change, because in the end that's something that changes priorities, and we go back to the political will and the priorities of the political leaders in and embracing or co-owning a guidance or a principle or an effort globally or regionally or within an alliance or even on its own.
I think that cost perspective is very interesting, and that's actually something I want to touch on. And so I know we shouldn't get too delved into the climate debate and the sort of how we can address climate change, because there's a brilliant panel later in the conference that I think everyone who's watching should definitely attend that will really drill down into it. But when we speak of cost, a lot of the opposition to climate action comes from countries and states where they perceive it to be too expensive to take action compared to this unknown future. How can we then, where the cost of building resilience is so high, convince actors that they do need to bear these costs now for this unknown future in which it may or may not pay off? And I'll come to you first on this. Preparing.
Yeah, I wish I had the answer to that. That's the big challenge, especially in an alliance of, 30 nations. Everybody has, Alex, you said it earlier, everybody has different focus areas within their nation of what they're willing to spend money on and what they're, willing to sacrifice in order to prepare for these discontinuities. And climate's a tough one, right? I mean, it's not about whether or not it exists. Obviously, climate change exists. I mean, you can see it every day, right? But it's about, for us thinking through what really could come of it. Where are the areas that are going to specifically affect not just NATO but the nations, and nations are going to have to choose what they invest their money in, and that's a tough one. I mean, that's the challenge of of an alliance, right? And having different perspectives. So I think the key is we just have to keep talking about it. We just have to keep studying it and really understanding, how quickly things are changing in certain areas. And it's a little bit of we have to get the experts involved. And I'm looking forward to the panel later. We have to get the experts involved, and they have to be a loud voice and say, hey, no kidding, you really have to focus your attention on these areas. And I think that's how you do it, right? And we have a loud voice from the NATO leadership saying, no, really focus on these areas. So we think it's valuable for the alliance as a whole.
If I can jump on that, I think that it goes down to the socioeconomic development between countries. Central and Eastern Europe is very much countries because Central and Eastern Europe is very much, they are still lagging behind Western Europe or the United States. So when we look at lagging behind Western Europe or the United States, so just transition, because I do like that concept of the just transition, because I do like that concept of the EU in this conversation. I think we also need to recognize the development lags that exist within the alliance or within the EU, because without those, we don't understand why certain countries or certain political leaders are less open to jump on, renewables and on net zero emissions immediately, because they know it's not possible from the infrastructure point of view. They still need to provide to the people, or they do not have resources, or there are many, many reasons there. So I think the way the just transition will happen will need to take into account the socioeconomic development part. The second maybe point, I was really happy to see NATO SG at COP26 in one of the panels, and also the alliance commitments following the Brussels Summit declaration. I think that here is one of the areas where the EU and NATO cooperation has the potential to accelerate and to enhance. The European Union has 750 billion recovery package, which is actually focused on the dual energy or climate digitalization and the transition for the 27 member states. Most of them are also part of NATO, and the other way around. The other members or allies of NATO are part of various partnership agreements with the EU. So I think that there is a potential for enhanced cooperation between the two, because there is this very big component of the socioeconomic development that NATO is not necessarily tying into it. So, and maybe last but not least, I think that the new generation will be a very big push and pull factor. There is awareness at the general public, and if we look at polls on various countries on what do young people feel about or think about the future and the threats of the future, or what do they care about, climate change and human rights are two very highly ranked priorities. And that's actually very, very good news, because those are the voices and those are the new voters. The demographics matter when it comes to elections. And so we are closing the circle on how can you influence the policy making and the political processes, also when you are just a regular, an ordinary student or an ordinary citizen from a small town, Poland or Romania.
Thank you, Alex. And Alex mentioned this EU-NATO cooperation. What scope is there for greater civilian military cooperation when it comes to both building resilience and addressing specific and visible discontinuities like climate change, but also like migration?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I couldn't agree more that civilian military cooperation is so very important. Being a lifelong member of military, we don't have all of the answers. We don't have all the answers. We have a very recognize that we have a very without perspective, without having that perspective, without having that cooperation, without cooperation, we're going to fail. So we all have to. We're going to fail. So we all have to. We're going to fail. So we all have to work together on this stuff. Cooperation. As far as you, cooperation. I know that's that's huge, and I know that's huge, and that's something I know that's huge, and that's something that every single day, every single day. So every single day. So here at ACT, here at ACT, I'm still got to speak to that about I know that it's that at that level. I know that speak to that at that level. Document that we read, every document that we read, document that we read, that we have so important cooperation. We have that cooperation.
Brilliant. And now I just want to bring that back to Alex. How do you bring that back to Alex? How do you think military cooperation could help military cooperation could military cooperation could help build resilience?
It helps. It helps. The more it helps, the merrier. That's not the merrier. That's the key. That's not the key. I think that the key. More difficult or bigger challenge is how bigger challenge is how when you're not necessarily deployed in a theater, or you're not in a theater, or you're not deployed in a theater. Or you're not, the Baltics were present on a sheep, were present on a sheep, on a sheep. And I'm talking because I did this before, and because I did this before, and because I did this before, and in Georgia was actually in Georgia, was actually in Georgia, was actually teams embedding militaries and embedding teams and embedding at least time for civilian periods at least for certain periods of time, actually built upon, actually built upon work together, being in the same place, and being in the same conversations, and being in the same conversation, and being in the same conversation, sometimes thoughts that are sometimes perspectives that would actually sometimes thought would I don't know about ACT, but I would actually I don't know about ACT. There is no center where you have both operations center where you have both military working together, where you have crisis management related issues, military working together on crisis management related issues. So I think that that's one of the models that actually work, but just by bringing people together, because that's when you also manage to see each other's perspective better, and somehow find the middle ground. In conflict management, we have a term called ZOPA, Zone of Possible Agreement. So that's where you have the debates and you have the ideas and you have the perspectives. But then at the end of the day, when you have to produce something together, you need to meet in the middle or somewhere in that zone of possible agreement to produce something, to have an outcome, and to work in this.
I'll just add one thing. And I'll just add one. It's hard for me to speak. And I'll just add one thing. It's hard for me to speak, at least again, on the national side, on the national side, that's where I think a lot of this civ-mil relationship and cooperations are built, right? Because anywhere there's a military base in a community, I know for naval bases, they are very much working together with the communities that they reside in to build resiliency, both civil and military, so that if something does happen, if we do have a black swan event or a discontinuity that affects, the area or, locally or regionally, they're ready to work together. And that's, so again, it probably goes back to what Alex said earlier, it has to happen at the national level. It has to happen within the nations. That's where that cooperation really has to take place, as opposed to, the large NATO organization trying to drive that.
Thank you. And thank you. And thank you. I think now I think now one question from the audience. I think it's quite relevant, and I know it's quite relevant, and I know you're probably not a climate expert. This is a more general point about the U.S. military. It has come into some criticism for. This comes from the U.S. The U.S. is the sole NATO member. The U.S. is the largest supplier with the world's largest supply of emergency. Do we need to have forward deployed? Do we need to have forward deployed? And also, when it comes to that, is there a need for it to become a renewables mix?
Well, that's a good question. Well, that's a very challenging question, and it's way above my pay grade. It's way above my pay grade. That I think we always need. I will say that I think we always need. So looking in the renewables world, in the renewables opportunity for us. There's always opportunity for us as far as energy goes. To grow our options. I don't think anybody would say, right? I don't think anybody would say, from we should look away from solar or from solar electric vehicles, from electric no one's going to say that because we have to. No one's going to say that because we have to use every option at develop at our fingertips that we can to make the world a better place and prevent us from to make the world a better place and prevent us from doing damage to our. In the end, we have what we have right now. In the end, we have what we have right now. Driving for. I think we just need to keep making it a better situation, making it a better energy. I know that didn't really answer the question. I know that didn't really answer the question. I can't speak to the U.S. forces, but at least I can give you my Al's opinion on that.
Thank you. I appreciate. Thank you. I appreciate that, and I very much recommend that, Nico, that you attend the later panel on climate, where I think you might get an answer with slightly more in depth. But now I want to take us back to not necessarily predicting the future, but looking at how the past has affected our present. And looking at the title of this panel, of course, the history of discontinuities, let us sort of take a think about what, in your opinion, is the most important and influential discontinuity that has occurred in the past that leads to our society existing. And again, I think this is a big what if question. But again, I think this is a big what if alternate history. Alex, almost alternate history. Alex.
I will say something very dear to my heart because I think that was the tipping point for Central and Eastern Europe, and it's also recent history, and I will say the end of the Cold War, because that's when Europe became whole and free again, and when many countries, including my own native country, managed to choose their own future through democratic elections and through becoming a democracy. So I think that the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, and the 1989 moment, while somehow predicted or at least expected and hoped for, is in my view one of those greatest moments of history or recent history for Atlantic Alliance as well. I would also mention 9/11, but I think that that's a bit more technical. I'm in between those two, but I think from more meta perspective, democracy and so on, I think that the end of the Cold War is that discontinuity that is actually a positive one, was a positive one for NATO and for the EU.
Another easy question. Let me tell you, you're coming up with them today. I think initially what popped in my head was 9/11, right? I mean, because that was it changed so many things for the world and the U.S. specifically. But something else that pops in my mind is, when I think about what's kind of the most dangerous area for us as NATO, to me, it's, the hybrid use of the internet, cyber, social media to really destabilize, a nation or an organization like NATO, because everybody has access. A young man or woman in their parents' basement can have way more devastating effect than in some cases, a tank or a ship, just because of what they can do with that computer and that access. So for me, I think the internet, and Will, you talked about it earlier, the creation of the internet, it just brought so many more potential threats to all of us because of the access. And I think every day, I see things happening in the news, and I'm like, man, if it wasn't for social media or if it wasn't for the internet, we wouldn't face these challenges. 20 years ago, we really didn't have those challenges. So I think for me, we really have to pay attention to, the cyber hybrid warfare and just how the internet influences our day-to-day operations.
No, that's a brilliant, and I very much agree on the internet front. I could talk about that for a very long time, but I realized that we are actually. So I wanted to turn it over to the two of you for just some closing remarks on our discussion today. Just some closing remarks on resilience in general. So we'll start with resilience in general. Resilience. So we'll start with Alex.
Yeah, no, I think that it was a very, very And I hope the audience got something out of it. I would just make 3 points maybe to reinforce what I said. I think that in order to have the what if mentality, we need political will and we need a political priority to be tagged along. If I'm looking at the what if of the future, what I'm most scared of, if I could build on your previous question, I would say that the militarization of the outer space for me is one of those key issues that we are not ready for, and I don't think that we have enough resilience. So the outer space could be a game changer, and the militarization not just by states and other countries, but also through the use of private actors. And the third, it's the power of communities and individuals actually to contribute to enhancing resilience. And I think that the younger generation has a key role from raising awareness to actually keeping leaders accountable for their decisions when it comes to their futures, and to make sure that they have a loud voice in the public space. So they use the internet for the good, because in the end, the internet is a tool that you could use for good or for the good or for the bad. So I think that those are the wrapping up 3 things that I would like to have the guys going for a drink after the panel.
Thank you, Alex. And Al, your thoughts. Thank you, Alex. And Al,
yeah, I would just say, I'm feeling good because an organization like Atlantic Forum, seeing that you're thinking about this topic, a year ago when I first got here and we were doing a discontinuities workshop, it's the first time I had ever really thought about the topic. But I think it's catching on. I think people recognize the importance of really spending some brain power on thinking about the what ifs. And I think you're right. Leadership has to drive this from the top. They have to be open and willing to understand their vulnerabilities, and that, we can't predict the future, and that, things are going to continue to happen. I don't think anybody would argue that surprises, strategic shocks are going away. But the fact that an organization like yours is thinking about this, the fact that NATO's thinking about this, the fact that this is happening in the nations is a good thing. And we're going to continue to do it here in Salt Branch. We're going to continue to do workshops and to we have an annual discontinuities report where we dive into a new topic every year. We're actually, I want to say real quickly, we're using fiction. We're using fiction to talk about the what ifs. We're working with some really good, world-renowned authors, Pete Singer and August Cole, who wrote Ghost Fleet and Burn-In. We're working with them to write fictional stories to kind of show what those discontinuities and what that future world could look like. Specifically with quantum technologies, we're focusing on quantum technologies this year, and what that world looks like with those capabilities, both in our hands and potentially in the adversary's hands. So, and we're going to share that with the world. So, I think as long as our organizations keep doing this, we're going to get better at large. So, thanks again for having us. This was an awesome opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you both. And I was just going to say, I'm definitely going to be keeping my eye out for those, because that sounds like a very interesting read. Now, just before we finished, I want to turn our attention to the Slido poll and the results of the poll. And if I may do so quickly, this should be popping up right next to me now. So for the first question, in your opinion, can we prepare for discontinuities? We had 75% of you say yes, and 75% of you say yes. 75% of you say yes, and one lone individual. I hope that by the end of this, I hope that by the end that we indeed can prepare, and maybe that we indeed can prepare, indeed can prepare. Individuals like Al and individuals like Al and groups like Salt really are confident doing the best they can. Now, onto how confident. Now, onto how confident. We seem to have a pretty good. We seem to have a pretty good. We seem to have a pretty good. I feel like we're getting 3.8 out of 5. I feel like we're getting again towards the end of the. But again, towards the end of the conference, I hope towards the end of at least a 4.5. And into a unexpected vicissitudes and shocks are the unexpected and shocks are the described. I would say that all of those are self-evident. I would say that all of those are pretty examples of self-continuities. Let's see. And the examples of invention of a new type of energy extraction. The invention of a type of energy extraction, and also I think is something very interesting. And also Russian and Chinese hostilities state in particular. Russian and Chinese hostilities now again in particular that are being ignored. Now again I think that is very able to address now. Definitely a topic that might be on everyone's mind. Don't think we're necessarily able to address now. Definitely a topic that's going on everyone's minds in the future. I think I'll take much about your understanding of resilience. Score of 4.3. I think we feel a little bit better on resilience than we are. Score of 4.3. I think we feel a little bit better on resilience than we are. And I hope discontinuity. That's very good to hear on that front. And I hope that even more panel today was illuminating on that front. In one word, people are using more survivability. In one word, NATO 2030 means survivability. Many people. NATO 2030. I think that is pretty accurate. And so I certainly that is pretty accurate. And then finally, I hope that good example of the alliance is resilient. And then finally, can you give the ability to survive and attack a natural disaster? The ability to survive and attack natural disaster. The shift to renewables on top of NATO's very important. The shift to renewables on top of NATO's Eastern European allies, and the ability to survive Northeastern European allies. And I want to thank you all for your participation, etc. I want to thank you all for your participation and sharing their. I want to thank my panelists with being all of us and sharing their knowledge and understanding. For those of you who are patrons will now. For those of you who aren't patrons, the patrons will now go and have exclusive cost-free networking sessions. Go and sign up to become a patron, and then have access. Go and sign up to become a patron, and then that's all. Have access to amazing. Thank you all very much for attending. But that's all from me this evening. Thank you all very much for attending.
Thank you all for great moderation.
You win again, extraterrestrial beast. Games are just a fun way to waste time, right? Not necessarily. Playing games could lead to new ways to combat modern threats. That's what we're looking at today in NATO Science. Around the world, people spend billions of hours a week playing games. But what if, rather than playing games aimlessly, we could divert this time and effort into solving security problems? Our scientist in Ankara has more.
I always remember a military trainer telling me, I have students playing Fortnite and I'm trying to teach them using PowerPoint. We use games at NATO to play through different scenarios. In the future, threats could come from all sides. Disinformation, urban warfare, cyber attacks, civil unrest, robots, drones, even augmented humans. Using games helps us imagine these scenarios.
The game is on, but how does it work?
We give our teams a problem and assign them different roles. Red team are hostile forces, green are the legitimate government, blue is NATO, yellow might be other non-governmental factors like aid workers or displaced people. Imagine a megacity of 10 million people divided into zones based on ethnicity. A hostile country uses those divisions as an excuse to capture the city's port, which is a lifeline to the citizens. But the hostile country doesn't use regular troops. They use unmarked paramilitary forces. Whatever methods NATO might use to stabilize that crisis, cyber, information, or kinetic, will have consequences for the population. A facilitator watching the game runs up a software that uses an algorithm that predicts the effects of each action. A riot, 1 point up the crisis meter. An epidemic, another point. If the crisis meter runs too high, NATO loses. The game is designed not to be won, but rather to manage the crisis and restore stability, which is one of the NATO's core tasks. But the game isn't the interesting part. It is the people who are playing. Where the science comes in is that we observe cognitive reactions. Although NATO is a consensus-based organization, we want argument. It is what we call matrix gaming. NATO needs people asking questions they haven't asked before, because these might be the questions that we need to answer to keep peace and security in the future.
Next episode, we'll take you to Florence in Italy to meet a robot taking the lead in the fight against landmines. Check out the rest of the videos in the series to learn more about NATO science. When a bomb needs to be defused, you might not want to be the one that goes first. That's why NATO scientists made a robot just right for the job. They call it the You Go First. Bomb disposal is one of the most dangerous jobs in the world, but it's vital to detect and remove unexploded ordnance before it can hurt people. Every year, thousands of civilians, the majority of them children, lose their lives and limbs to landmines or other explosive remnants of war. With their new robot, NATO scientists are making the job of clearing these deadly devices a little safer. Here's our scientist at the University of Florence in Italy with more.
Using robots to detect landmines is not new, but the You Go First is unique in two significant ways. First, it's smaller and is more agile than many other mine-detecting robots. That means it can get to work on difficult terrains and maneuver around obstacles. These are key talents in a disaster area. Secondly, it uses two different kinds of radar. The first is a fast-acting impulse radar that stops the robot as soon as it detects an object, setting off an alarm. The second is a holographic radar that creates images rather than sounds to show the operator what kind of object has stopped the robot. A third sensor, a three-dimensional depth camera, provides additional information about the soil relief to improve the radar imaging. Is it an explosive or is it just a can? This means the operator can do the whole detection phase from a safe distance. This project is developed jointly by Italy, the United States and NATO partner Ukraine, a country that has a lot of dangerous old ordnance from former conflicts. Thanks to support from NATO's Science for Peace and Security program, we can help them to make their land safer without putting people at risk.
Check out the rest of the videos in the series to learn more about NATO science.
Excellent.
Yes,
All
we're
good to
good
go, John?
Wonderful. We're live. Fantastic. Oh, righty. Gonna click it on. Right. So welcome back all again. You probably know who I am, but just for clarity's sake, my name is John Jacobs, the director and one of the co-founders of the Atlantic Forum, together with my dear friend and colleague Igor Murheim, who unfortunately is not able to join us today due to family business. Nothing too severe, I understood. But nevertheless, priorities are always with the home front. But nevertheless, we still have two very great people with us, Hannah Christensen and Mark Tilley. We'll get a bit to why we got them there, because the title, that's first what I want to touch into. Yes, sorry, Hannah. I know that. So side thing completely. Now we're going completely off topic. You don't know yet, but we agree with Hannah that this is going to be our very first podcast. So we're going to do this more often. She doesn't know yet, but it'll be fine. Anyway, so what is this podcast? What is this session all about? For those that joined us half a year ago, we had a similar session like this at the very end. And I imagine, but sadly with COVID, it's not there yet, but I imagine they were actually standing on stage with having like a bar table and just a couple of young people hang around at a bar table trying to discuss all matters of world politics. I actually think that's a great concept for a podcast. And what we're going to talk about today is this question about, right, so what are we going to do about it? So the previous panel in the keynote pretty much portrayed it, well, we're not all going to do down to it. It's not all bad stuff going out there, but there's definitely things that we have to fix. So the question can be then twofold. What are we generally as the transatlantic community going to do about it? But more importantly, so what are we here at this imaginary pub table in this imaginary conference room, us young professionals gathered here under the banner of Atlantic Forum, what are we going to do about it? So with that, we have two wonderful guests. Hannah, first floor to you. Hannah, please introduce yourself to our podcast listeners.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah Christensen. It's very nice to meet you all. And yes, like you said, this is our virtual pub table that I'm happy to have you join us at. Of course, for me, it's still a coffee table this early in the morning. But to introduce myself, I am the program coordinator for the NATO Field School. That's a program that's run out of Simon Fraser University here in Canada. And so that ended up involved with the Atlantic Forum because we have this common goal of increased youth engagement in transatlantic issues. And so it's something that I'm very excited to be talking more about today. And I'm very pleased that we get to be on the optimistic panel of looking forward and finding new solutions and how we're going to save the world. So thanks so much for having me.
Well, wonderful. And then we also have our British, Maltese, Algerian. I actually have no clue what you are, Mark. Mark, please enlighten us. Who are you?
I'm a very complicated international mess, and I'm very happy to be able to unpack that on my first virtual podcast. Well, I suppose all podcasts are virtual. A pub table from the comfort of my own home. I couldn't ask for more. So I'm Mark. I currently work for the International Organization for Migration, which is a UN body that's very program centric. So we have within our mandate, we work on anything relating to people on the move, and we also have a security component to our mandate. That includes the return of or reintegration of foreign terrorist fighters, demobilization, disarmament, even de-radicalization, and this is the kind of thematic area that I work on. And it's very important to state at this moment as well that I am not representing this organization in anything I say. My boss will be very relieved to hear that disclaimer. Nice note. My background is in humanitarianism. It's in human security and human rights. And so you can think of me as coming into like the security arena kind of horizontally, because what we have in common with the kind of the security sector is that we work in the same context and are largely trying to achieve the same, i.e. peace. Not everyone may share that view, but I can be an optimist at times, and that's that's how I picture it.
Wonderful, wonderful, very positive remarks. And Hannah already kind of touched upon it with the Native Field School. Mark, with you as well. Both of you also have a decent history of various young professional groups, engagement, showing the world that young professionals can actually contribute quite well to the high level. And we've also seen that past month when both of you joined us in, no, Hannah, I'm not going to say it. It was Vicenza in Italy. Internal joke. At one point, it was referred to Florence, and one of our esteemed participants was convinced that they were in a different Italian city. See, that's really what COVID does to you, this whole lack of travel, this lack of knowing where we are exactly at one given point. Anyway, so we gathered in Vicenza at the Center of Excellence Directors Conference, where we had a small delegation of our young professionals joining in order to properly contribute, I'd say, to thinking of ACT. And that nicely loops back into what a large part of this conference this weekend is all about, is indeed the sort of the brain power, the thinking part of NATO, which is based in Norfolk, Virginia. But going back a bit more to the history of the stuff you've done in the past, Mark, you've been involved with election monitoring, you've been involved with YPFP. Well, you're now involved with us, so I think that's absolutely fantastic. But where would you say are really the things that you say, right, this was a very special, great moment, and we should totally be doing more about it because this is how we're going to fix things?
So, well, that's a big question. So, how to fix things and where to start. I'm going to very overtly evade your question, and I'm going to touch on something that you kind of started with regard to my background, because one, youth inclusion in the security agenda is really, really important to me. I think it's more than important. I think it's essential. I think it's essential to the security agenda functioning and understanding the societies within which it is asked to provide an effect. And so everything that I've done in some way relates to that. So you talked about election monitoring. To me, that kind of reflects the democratic aspect of youth participation in the security agenda. We all benefit from peace and from security. We are all stakeholders to peace and security, and we are all agents to peace and security, in as much as we don't only benefit from it, but we have a responsibility to enable it. And young people, as part of that society, I think, are often overlooked. And so there's a real kind of like democratic component to my motivation. And then I don't remember what the second thing was that you mentioned. Oh, YPFP. So yeah, so that's the young professionals in foreign policy is a brilliant kind of like incubator for ideas and for engagement, and I think it's very much built on the idea that young people today are the future leaders, and so if we can find ways to kind of like develop skills, competencies, and kind of exchange knowledge and experience, then we are essentially kind of planting the acorns of success. If there's an oak tree acorn metaphor that I think Winston Churchill made that I was trying to recall, and then I was too ambitious. I forgot it halfway through. But when it comes to fixing things, big picture, I think it's really mainstreaming of actors who make a very important part of our society and who have not traditionally been part of the security kind of discourse. And for me, these two things are kind of gender and youth, young people. We are the biggest demographic in society who historically have not been able to have a voice, in as much as under the age of 18, you have no way to participate in the democratic process. You can't vote. And if you can't vote, there is no incentive for decision makers to appeal to you. There's no incentive for them to reach out to you. And so for a very long time kind of worked in youth participation and youth engagement, because I think that's a real it's a scandal. I'm now going to defer to Hannah and her infinitely more coherent wisdom maybe I can offer.
Well, Hannah, anything to add to that based on what you've been doing with the NATO Field School, but also with the hackathon? Or you had a team from Simon Fraser University joining. So
Yeah.
How was that? Do you feel you've been properly being able to contribute to the discussions that NATO was trying to have there?
I definitely think that there's sort of two sides to the importance of youth engagement. One would be for youth. I mean, all of us here in the Atlantic Forum and in YPFE, everything else, we want to get involved in these careers in security and defense and international relations, and it can be really hard to try and figure out what the right way in is, what the path is to get to a career like that. So there is a side of it that I think youth engagement is important for youth, for us in the future to get involved in this field. To have our voices heard now is also really important, to feel like we belong in this conversation. It can be a really tough nut to crack, it feels like, at times like this. And so having events like the NATO Policy Hackathon that I was part of earlier this year can be really important to make sure that youth feel like we are actually part of this conversation. That was a great event in that we had our Secretary General joining us. So I think that was a really important step in showing he is here, he's listening to the ideas that you want to put forward. And that definitely really matters in getting youth involved at this stage in our career. The other side of it, and something like the NATO Field School, is it's important to have youth engagement for the future of the alliance. These are the future policy leaders, especially for us on the civilian side, and making sure that youth feel like an organization like NATO, for example, is really important to our future security and defense. Getting this in now and making sure they feel like that as they go up through their career is going to be important for NATO in the future. As Mark said, a lot of the conversation now is trying to involve people in this discussion that have been previously ignored. So based on gender, I think for us, it's along racial lines as well. And for youth, getting more diverse voices into this conversation is going to be important so that in the future, we also feel like NATO matters. Because if the youth don't feel like NATO matters, then at a certain point, we're going to be the policymakers, and that's really going to affect an organization like this. NATO depends on the people who are going to be bringing a policy through it, and eventually that's going to be us as well. So there's sort of two sides to that youth engagement that I think are really important. And looking to the future, we're not going to be youth forever. But for right now, I think that seeing us just as youth engagers is a tricky way to look at it. I think, as you said, finding ways to make sure that our voices are heard and matter now is going to be important now and into the future. So a good tie back is our conference earlier this last month, I suppose, where we were involved as a youth delegation. Essentially, we were called the Young Disruptors at the NATO COE Directors Conference. And so we were in a really different role than anyone else there, in that everyone else was a Center of Excellence director. So folks who are really smart and experts in their field and have been involved in their fields for years upon years. And so for someone like me coming in at the ground level, that can be quite intimidating. But to see, especially in that context, people really take you on and listen to the ideas you have and really integrate you into the conference can be so important in that experience for me, but definitely moving forward as well.
Absolutely. I can, of course, only agree with that for obvious reasons. But I feel you're touching upon a very, very important part here when it comes to it cuts on both sides, right? So there's something to gain there from the young professional view. Well, I would say even maybe on three sides. There's something to gain from the young professional who is involved with that, who get to go to places and discussions where they normally don't get involved with directly. And even though that they might be the junior part in the table and they may not know everything, and probably they don't, but hey, newsflash, probably the senior person at the table also doesn't, but don't tell them that. But what is nice, and I really liked it in Vicenza, but also in other things that I've been involved with professionally, is that if you're the person to ask the questions like, hey, why are you doing it this way? And if you do that well, and then not in a way that sort of is criticizing, but generally because you don't know how or why things are done a certain way and you want to figure it out, it can often provide with very good insight on, it's like, what, there was a decision that we made, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And back then that made sense to do it this way, but we never stood still and reflected on that whether it still makes sense. So I think that's a very valid contribution that young people have. And then, of course, as you said, it's interesting career-wise. You get to go to places, you get to network, etc. That's all good. But then the third one is, I think, a sort of movement against what I might call token youth engagement. So we've often seen in the past, I'm not going to call out names or blame anyone because it's simply a process that we're starting to learn and start to do better. And I think the hashtag We're NATO campaign has been the most instrumental vehicle on that. Well, we've more and more seen young professionals being equals on stage, being equals in terms of thought and in terms of the discussions. Starting off with NATO Engages that had young people sitting in on panels publicly, which was like, this is like the big official NATO side event, and suddenly we're seeing young people pop up left and right. Like, hey, that's interesting. There's something going on here, and then that's developed further onto the NATO 2030 Young Leaders Experts. Who I'm very proud to also call our patrons. And I'm not going to pretend that we have the same impact as, say, a Greta Thunberg, who at the age of 18 is definitely causing some disruption there. And I suppose that there are more people that are wondering about climate than there are people wondering about NATO, so all is fair there. But would you guys feel that the sort of, if we take this trend of, say, the past 4 years of a new way of youth engagement, is it paying off? Is NATO getting somewhere with this? So, Mark, to you first.
So I think before I start to answer that question, I'd like to just congratulate you on correcting Firenze to Vicenza. It's an easy mistake to make, and I'm relieved to see you get it right. Actually, if I might, I really want to kind of echo something that Hannah pointed out when I talked about kind of mainstreaming.
Go for it.
When I talked about kind of having non-traditional communities who are generally kind of untapped in like the conversation, this also means their skill set and their knowledge is untapped. And we have big communities. So we talked about young people, we talked about gender. And also, like, I'd like to include like neurodivergent people, and also Hannah talks about kind of race or ethnicity. These are communities that have historically kind of been excluded from like security conversations, and I think it's really, really important to have a security kind of agenda that reflects that. And even from the most kind of closed-minded perspective, there needs to be a recognition that more brains, more experiences, more collective experiences just mean more opportunities to think innovatively, right? And NATO talks all about innovation, and innovation means doing things differently. Now, the military has this kind of culture of deferring things backwards is the expression that's used, and that means when you're faced with a complicated situation, thinking to how it's always been done and maintaining it. To me, this is the opposite of innovation. And so I'm very keen to kind of introduce a bit of that disruptor mindset to different challenges. And I think there's this culture that if a new thing doesn't work, then the dinosaurs are proved correct. If a new thing doesn't, then the idea is that innovation or coming up with alternative kind of ways of doing things is somehow wrong, which is a very dangerous kind of mindset. I think the methodology of trying new things is very, very important. If they don't work, then that means keep innovating, keep trying until you find something that does work. Yes, and when we talk about young people, when we talk about kind of youth participation, I think there is a risk that we only do so with the mindset that young people are the future of something, the future leaders, the future decision makers. And I recognize that, but I also want to caveat that with young people are also, they're also an important force now in this moment. They're not a qualified voice. It's not that we'll only talk to you because you will matter in 20 years time. No. Your contribution matters now, particularly when you look at societies where NATO contributes. When we talk about peace building, and this is injecting a bit of the humanitarian kind of mindset or development mindset. When you talk about peace building, what you often need, especially in like ethnically or religiously kind of based conflicts, you need generational change. You need cultural change, which takes a generation. That means investing in young people, having a generation of young people to separate conflict towards a period of peace. This is what you need to have sustainable, long-lasting peace. And this is something that the defense kind of machine has been very recognized. So I think the sooner kind of like we learn this lesson, the sooner we can have a lot more of an effect. Young people today, and I kind of mean anyone under the age of 30, will really struggle to recall or resonate with like a NATO strategic success, like in their lifetime. And that's something that's very important because credibility, NATO's credibility as an institution comes from people respecting it, people from understanding and trusting it as an institution. And this is very hard. This is a very hard sell to young people, particularly those people who will think of NATO as visually very, very chaotic Afghanistan evacuation as a Taliban resurgence. So I think we need to recognize how NATO looks from a young people's perspective in order to kind of move forward. And I think the NATO, I'm going to use the wrong name, not intentionally, but out of ignorance. There is this NATO Young Advisory, right, which I think the criteria for that is being within the ages of 25 and 35. And John, I say this with no personal weight to you, but there comes a point where relative youth does not mean youth. If you're 30, I'm not sure to what extent you are representing the voices of the entire youth community. There are people at 35 who are NATO experts in their own right without the youth qualifier. And so it gets this point of also, recognizing that in a machinery that has an average age of 55, being 35 is relatively young. But is it absolutely young? Do you represent the voices of young people, this generation who are growing up with this generation's challenges and this generation's exposure to new domains of warfare, cognitive warfare, cyber warfare? Kids who grow up with their entire lives on computers have a very, very important perspective to share and perhaps a range of solutions that someone who is slightly older than them but hasn't had that experience might not have.
No, you're absolutely correct, and I'm not taking offense, even though I'm only 31. Thank you very much. Well, but you're right. If you look at the young leaders group, so the 14 young leaders that were selected to be part of, well, I think the full name is NATO 2030 Young Leaders. Indeed, they are between age 25 and 35, and many of them, and then some of them I've known for quite a while now. It's not that they are sort of special because they're young. If you take Alice, for example, she is a research associate at Chatham House in her full own right. The young part doesn't matter. Ulrich, a gentleman that I've been knowing for a very long time since I was on the board together with him when we were running YATA. He's definitely at the slightly also at the 30 plus side. But the moniker young doesn't contribute to any of these persons. So that I actually agree with you. But then compared to who NATO usually has sort of in the crowd or advising, or if you look at so the Young Leaders group was a counterpart to a NATO expert group. Then they're definitely young. They're very, very young. And that actually is, I think, an issue that NATO has been struggling with quite a bit. And one thing that we have on our website that we use and abuse all the time is a quote from a former SACTI official who is stating that if he could, he would replace 30% of his staff with young people, which already suggests that the current status quo is not having 30% young people. So less than 30% of his staff are below the age of 35. So even if you were to replace everyone with being 35, it would be young. But you strike a very valid point, because by now the generations have been moving forward and forward. Like, I'm a millennial, and after millennials we have Generation Z, and now the current next thing is Generation Alpha. But the oldest people of Generation Alpha are already turning 18 this year. So already 2 generations lacking behind. And you're rightfully put out. Like, if I look at sort of all the new stuff that's out there, and in terms of cyber, digital, and whatnot, like, I'm already old. I can't keep up with this stuff. So let alone that the senior officials who are actually describing policy can fix this. So I absolutely agree with you. If you want to have more insight into it, you're gonna find or try to find the talent between, say, 18 and 25, like people who are currently doing the bachelors and early masters, but have the brilliant ideas. But it is, of course, very tricky to find a person who is and has great thoughts, but is also mature enough and confident enough. I think that's also a very important aspect to say, like, look, I actually have a great idea. I wanna get up on stage and talk about this stuff. Hannah, being our academic in the room, or at least our academic associate, is it something that you also see with the students at Simon Fraser, or the ones that are involved with the field school? Field school is Canada-wide, right? It's not just Vancouver students.
Yes, I was going to say, as the resident 18 to 25 who is still in their academic career, let me swoop in. And I can tell you, to assuage your fears of being 2 generations out, I think the Gen Zs, because I'm right on the cusp. I'm the oldest Gen Z. I think you can pretty much get. I think we're still in the group that's coming of age, I guess, at this point. I think the alphas are still going through childhood, and we can leave them be for now. But I'm sure they'll be coming up and into this conversation very soon. I think that for us, it can be very intimidating, of course, to get involved in a conversation like this. You are really in this point in career, like the 18 to 25 that you're talking about, you're right on that curve of realizing there's so much that you don't know, and it's to the point that you get quite intimidated. Right, I think you know everything. We're just past that to know there's so much that we don't know, and can get quite intimidating, as I said. But I think that having youth engagement that forces you out of that bubble and forces you into a position that you really need to speak for yourself. For me, that was our conference last month. We were given the moniker of Young Disruptors, and there was a little bit of contention about whether that was the right term for us and what that really meant. But I think that one interesting part of it was that the stability policing COE that organized the conference actively avoided the term young professional or youth ambassador. They went with disruptor, and disruptor, to me, it can mean a lot of things, but I think what that told me specifically, and why I got very nervous in coming into the conference, was that I was supposed to have an active role. I'm there to disrupt things. And so that meant that my voice was really important to how the conference was going to go forward. And that was an absolutely terrifying concept to me going into it, because I am absolutely at that point. I don't know anything. So I know at least just barely enough to know that I don't know anything. So I think that can be a very nerve-wracking concept to a lot of people in this age group. And definitely something I've seen through my academic engagement I can give a quick little plug for the NATO Field School, of course. It's not just Vancouver, it's not just Canada, it's actually open to university students across the Alliance. So it's a great program to be involved in if you're interested in this sort of thing. But more to the point, I think we do a lot of surveys of our students coming in and out of the program. And the folks coming into the program are kind of exactly who you would be expecting. It's young folks, usually I think the average age is about 20, who are interested in international relations, interested in political science, but really have been focused on the politics side. So, you know, they have more grandiose ideas of, in the future, I'd like to work at the UN because that's the one they've heard of. They, you know, come into our program usually not knowing a lot about defense, not knowing a lot about how their armed forces works, and really not knowing what NATO does. And so in bringing in, we've talked a lot about bringing new voices that have obviously ignored into these conversations. But what's interesting to me is looking at the students coming into a program like this. These are people that ostensibly should be interested and should be knowledgeable about something like NATO, and yet it's still really not the center of the conversation for us. So that's definitely, I think, a sign of how important youth engagement for an organization like NATO is going to be going forward. And I'm glad that I get to be part of 2 organizations at this point that are really helping them with that job.
All right, that's absolutely fantastic, great stuff. And I wish I was a student again so I could enroll into the field school, but unfortunately I'm not. Right, so we're down to our last 10 minutes and we still haven't figured out yet. So how are we going to fix things? What are we going to do about it? Like very concretely, is there anything that you would say, right, this is something that a young professional, preferably member of Atlantic Forum, doesn't have to be, could be anyone, can do, well, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not this year because we only have 2 months left, but say like your New Year's resolution 2022, this is what I'm going to do to help NATO and help the transatlantic community to be better prepared against discontinuities. Mark, if you go first, and then we'll go with Hannah, and then we'll round up our little podcast.
Well, I suppose, you know, if I could, you know, turn your question into a plea, it would be that NATO helps us to help them. So I think, while I'm a firm believer that, you know, we can provide some solutions, I also, you know, I'm also frustrated with the idea that, you know, excluded communities, you know, should then be left to fix their own exclusion. You know, I think a degree of that responsibility has to come from the big NATO kind of ecosystem itself. I think they need to give us some tools, and one of those tools would be very simply access. I think the COE Directors Forum, Conference, was a fantastic forum, a fantastic platform for us. It was a really good trust building exercise. I think it went very well. And I was really genuinely impressed by how non-token the event was. And I'm absolutely very, very happy to say that if I felt it was token, our contribution was token, you know, I'd be very unhappy about it, and I'd be saying that. I really genuinely felt that there was a degree of respect, a degree of credibility, of trust, and they gave us a protected space within which to operate. They said, this space is yours, and it won't be, it's ring fenced, it's not going to be shrunk. However, that space focused exclusively on methodology. We were there to disrupt the thinking process, not necessarily the knowledge process. So we were there to disrupt how conclusions were reached, but not to inject new information perspectives or youth perspective as such. We didn't change the content. And so I think it was a very, very good kind of first, you know, opening of the door for us. But I really think the next steps have to come with giving young doctors a bit more space to add a youth perspective. And you know, this doesn't have to come overnight. You know, I don't want to scare anyone who might be watching away, but you know, this has to be the thing. There has to be a way for us to share our kind of like experiences, and our perspective with these kind of forums, because there's this phenomenon in kind of like the military or any hierarchical organization, where they're always a generation behind. If we talk about a generation being 25, 30 years, that's how long it takes to reach flag or general rank. So by the time you are senior enough in a position to shape it, you are shaping it with a culture or a perspective that's outdated. It comes from 25 to 30 years ago, and so I suspect there's always this kind of lag in military kind of cultural awareness or any kind of machinery that's kind of very hierarchical. And this is what I see a lot in NATO. So if there's a way to maybe not shrink that as such, but maybe just catapult a few younger voices to levels that they traditionally wouldn't be kind of heard at, then that would be great. I think we saw at this conference that to be a director of a COE, requires a career's worth of experience, and I think we looked at between, colonel, full colonel, and 1-star. And so, if we can find a way to kind of inject maybe more current voices to those challenges, voices that also haven't been shaped by a career full of staff training. I think within NATO, the orders process is very similar, and so the leadership process is very similar. The estimate process is similar. So what you do is you take a lot of very kind of original and very diverse kind of people, and then you mold them through a very one-dimensional kind of thinking and analysis process. And I think there's a lot of value to be taken from exposing people at the top level to that kind of that way of thinking that they maybe had before they were kind of shaped by the same kind of system-wide training.
All right. One thing that I definitely want to stress from this again is that we then also have this almost moral obligation, if you will, to do things right. So to just stand on the side and complain that we're not being involved, that's on our own conto. So that's definitely one thing that I'll bring with me as a New Year's resolution for 2022. Now, Hannah, over to you. Your New Year's resolutions. How are you gonna change the world? How are you gonna fix discontinuities in the coming year?
I think, Mark makes a really good point to make sure that, organizations like NATO leave that door open a crack for us. But like you said, John, the rest of it is on us to, run right through it. And what I've been trying to do in, I guess, both of my roles now is to make sure that as young people, we're helping each other get through those opportunities. I think that a field like this, you can see it as very closed off and it can get very competitive. So making sure that we're working together to find opportunities for young people. And that's sort of going to be my New Year's resolution, I suppose, in my role is trying to find these opportunities, not just for myself, but to try and bring others through that door with me. I think that's going to be really important, that we have organizations like the Atlantic Forum where, it's not just I'm a young person and I'm looking for ways to, make my way up that ladder by myself. I think it's way more important that we all work together to try and bring ourselves up to the top as a team. So that's, I think Mark otherwise covered it really well, but that's my New Year's resolution. So I'm glad I already figured that out November 5th. That's all I had to do for the rest of the year, right? And so I'm covered until January. So glad you guys helped me figure that out now.
Well, there's still, making plans is one thing right now about execution. So you still can figure it out for the coming, say, 45 days on how to go about it. And Mark has been stealing the thunder left and right again. Love it. We're nearing the end of our little session, which I think closes in about 3 minutes. Let me check that really quickly. Don't want to leave our audience waiting if we actually have more time. and then we go back to Petra to close this part. So if I can then sort of fill in one more question. If we're talking about very, very practical, is there any idea that, and we're going to assume that we don't have any limitations in terms of manpower or finances or whatsoever. But yeah, something that you want to do, and spoiler alert, there's a little trick to be made with with one of our initiatives called the Atlantic Forum Incubator, which is, and it's also a call to action to our listeners of this lovely semi-podcast, that if you have any ideas, pitch them to us, send us an email, contact us via WhatsApp, or what really doesn't really matter how you get a hold of us, and pitch it there, because that's what we're trying to do here as well, right? We're just going to throw 10 juggling balls up in the air, and I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 stick, and the rest doesn't, and that's perfectly fine if they don't stick at the moment. We'll just put them on the shelf, and we'll try again next year. So to fill up our last 7 minutes or so, from both of you, one pitch, ad hoc. Mark, think on your feet. You're good at that. I know that that you can do that. Give me one idea that you want to execute, if no limitation whatsoever.
So, John, thank you for the invitation. As always, I'm full of ideas, right off the cuff. But I've noticed I've been answering the questions first, and in the interest of gender balance, I think it's really important that we give Hannah the opening on this one. So I'm going to take a back seat, and I'm going to let Hannah take this forward.
All right, if that, I really like it. WPS and whatnot.
Oh my God, the first one that I finally went, thank goodness Mark is going first on this, so that I have some time to think. All the rest I'm going, oh no, Mark is going first. He's going to take all of my ideas. I don't know. I think, the concrete pitch is a tough one. And I think that, we were watching recently the COP26 speeches and everything, and we can see, even from the top levels, coming up with the policies and ideas on how to move forward with our big ideas can be really tough. I can tell you that for me personally, the concrete things that I want to be working on over the next while, and if anyone in the audience is listening and gets interested, we're working on the Atlantic Forum, the Academy. We're going to be working on our COE engagement initiative, which I'm really excited to push forward even further. And I think that, as we've shown, our most concrete example for the three of us on how we want to move youth engagement forward comes from our experiences last month at that one conference. And I think we've all been involved in a lot of youth engagement over the years. And so the fact that we all kind of have one thing that we're pointing to on, this is what we want to build on going forward, how do we want to make it even better? That's just really singing the praises of it to me even further. That shows how great trying to bring in a new idea like this. So I think that's going to be as concrete as I'm able to get on the spot here. So I'll throw it back over to Mark. Thanks so much for that.
So thank you very much, Hannah. Not stealing my idea as well. I'm going to buy myself a tiny bit more time by
Mark, if I may
sharing with
intercede, I recall a very interesting discussion we had about another organization called the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And I think you had some ideas about that, how we could do more youth engagement with, well, not per se that organization, but young parliaments in general, parliamentarians, I should say.
So for the first 10 seconds of that remark, I really thought you were stitching me up. I was trying to
Oh, come on, Mark. Is that how you think of me? Oh.
I'm just going to explain this continuity error to our 48,000 live viewers on YouTube currently, and about half that again on Facebook. When I saw the signal come up that said we still had 8 minutes left, I panicked because I was losing battery at a rate of about 1% a minute. And I did the maths and it wasn't going to last. So I just turned my camera off to plug in. I had to unplug the light to plug in my charger. So if any eagle-eyed viewers noticed the there's your answer. And your prize is my answer, I suppose. Yes. So going back to my point about democracy, young people are a fundamental component to the democratic process, democratic participation, democratic engagement, both now in their current form as the biggest stakeholder who don't have, structural influence in how policy is made, and also future leaders. With that in mind, I am an election observer with OSCE. And this is a very dinosaur-riddled field. A lot of people who I do election observation with would be offended by that, but they also don't know how to work YouTube, so they won't be watching this. It's one of those fields where a certain degree of experience is required, a certain professional profile, which makes it quite inaccessible to young people, but actually is quite intuitive. The qualification for being an election observer, in my mind, is having done election observation. And because of this vicious cycle, it's quite exclusive, whereas the reality is anyone can be put through the process. And once you've done one mission, you've done 100. And so I'm very keen to move forward the idea of young people participating in the election observation process through the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Most big parliamentary assemblies, so the European Parliament, the Council of Europe, and NATO and OSCE, send parliamentarians as recipients of the democratic process, people who have received the democratic vote and who know how election campaigns can and should be run, to go and observe democratic processes. They're not the experts, but they are very well-informed and useful contributors. And so I think the next step for the NATO Parliamentary Assembly is to reach out to young people, or the next step for the Atlantic Forum is to offer our availability to the Parliamentary Assembly, to say we have young people who have a voice, who have a stake, who are as qualified as you are. I don't want to name any individual kind of politicians, but I think we've seen this year that a lot of very, very high profile leaders are not necessarily that experienced or competent or qualified for their role. And so I don't think the argument that is typically used to suppress kind of young people's voice, that we're not qualified or experienced, has any credibility in this case. I think it would be very good for NATO as a trust-building exercise to show that we are taking young people seriously and we are listening to young people. If we look at the biggest threats to democracy, the cognitive domain and the cyber domain at the moment, we look at disinformation. These are emerging kind of threats that have both exploited young people, in the sense that young people have been used to generate these threats because they are very technologically kind of aware. Also been the recipients, in that they are also the bigger consumers of these kind of online platforms. So I think there's a very, very strong case for young people to be part of like the democratic kind of observation process. And I think that's a very, very kind of exciting way forward. The other thing that I would say would be that young people should continue to collaborate with the Centers of Excellence, even though they are NATO accredited as opposed to part of the NATO core structure. They are at the forefront of innovation. They are at the forefront of developing doctrine, identifying emerging threats, and finding solutions. And that's where young people come in. We are the innovators and the disruptors of NATO. And I think it's very important that we are given that opportunity, to create that opportunity by making ourselves available to continue pushing with the Centers of Excellence.
All right, so I think we've got two most excellent ideas. I also have a very angry, well, I'm not sure if she's angry, but Petra, who wants to close down our session. No, kidding. No, so this was absolutely fantastic. I'm looking very forward to. Oh, she now texts that I'm being mean. I'm not being mean at all, Petra. I love you. You know that. Hannah, Mark, thank you very much for this wonderful contribution. I'm looking very forward to work with both of you in the coming year to see if we can develop these ideas further. Again, call to action. Anyone else who has any brilliant ideas or has been inspired by this session, please do reach out to us. We're going to stop here. Petra, over to you. Thank you very much again to you and your team for organizing all of this. It has been absolutely fantastic this evening, and I'm looking very forward to the rest of the weekend. Cheers.
And with that brilliant insight into Atlantic Forum, we have come to an end of our first day. Thank you all so much for joining us today for the conference opening. We have laid some important grounds for upcoming panels, and we are looking forward to welcoming you all tomorrow morning with the keynote address by Chair of the NATO Military Committee, Admiral Roy Bauer, at 10:20 Central European Time. Until then, have a great evening, and we'll see you tomorrow morning.